Hey, it's Kevin Lawton with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And today's episode is going to be on fire. No, not literally on fire. We're going to be talking about the topic of fire safety, fire suppression within the warehouse, which is a very, very important topic, sometimes complicated, tricky topic because some of the rules and regulations can certainly vary depending on your location, depending on the town that you're in, and those fire codes that are in place. But we're going to talk to Ralph Bless, and he is the executive vice president over at Telgian, and he's going to dive into these topics with us. And we're also going to talk about how fire codes are not necessarily evolving or able to keep up with some of the automation that's coming into the warehousing space, and particularly around ASRS systems, which I think is a really important conversation to have. So definitely interested to dive into this and kind of tap into Ralph's wealth of knowledge here on fire safety. So, Ralph, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Looking forward to today.
Absolutely. Happy to get you on and happy to talk about this topic. I think it's very, very important topic. Hopefully we don't see too many fires out there, but we want to be prepared and make sure that the right measures are in place to be able to do that. But before we kind of dive further into this topic, why don't you kind of give us just a brief overview of Telgin and what it is that you guys do?
Yeah, so I work for a company by the name of Telgian Engineering and Consulting. We've been around for it'll be 39 years, I guess, this year. Started out in the space providing consulting and engineering and design of fire protection systems. We also do security systems. My focus with the organization is really on warehousing and particularly the fire protection aspects around warehousing. We have a
Mm,
sister company that also does inspection testing. Telgian Corporation, Telgian Fire Safety is what we know it as. But yeah, and I've been with the company. It'll be 26 years this year. So in the
nice,
industry,
nice.
about 40.
40. All right, we got a lot of experience on the show today, so we're definitely going to tap into that. And yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting, and I'm definitely interested to get your insights here. But I guess let's kind of before we start to talk about all these technological advancements and everything that's been happening in the industry and how that impacts fire safety. I think it's important for us to maybe get a foundational understanding baseline for people maybe that are not familiar, or just kind of maybe take it for granted that there's fire suppression in place within a warehouse. So tell us kind of what does a typical fire suppression system look like in a traditional warehouse? I mean, what does that look like for the years now?
Yeah, so there's two basic types that are most common in these warehousing environments. One is a wet pipe fire sprinkler system, and another one is a dry pipe fire sprinkler system. There's a variety of other types that we can talk about, but those are the two primary ones. And wet pipe, as it kind of indicates, this water is at the sprinkler all the time. It's just waiting for that
Mm,
sprinkler to operate. With dry pipe, because you might be in a freezing condition. You might have outside piping outside. You might have a
mm,
cold storage warehouse. You have to protect those cold environments so that the piping doesn't freeze, and so that piping has got air or nitrogen inside of it, holds the valve closed until the sprinkler opens and allows that water to enter into the system. I think that's
mm,
probably another key item that we should probably mention is a lot of people have the perception that sprinklers are like what you see in the movies where one activates, they all activate. And that's
yeah.
just not the case. You know, they
Mm,
activate typically one at a time. There are some special systems that do that, but they are very unusual and not typically used in a storage facility. So, so yeah, that's the two basics again are the wet pipe and the dry pipe. About probably 80% of the facilities out there are going to have the wet pipe sprinkler systems. You
mm,
might also have, depending on your warehousing, you might have sprinklers inside of your racking structure. If you have a
right.
rack structure, typically referred to as in-rack sprinklers. Um, and you will find some older facilities, you know, from the 60s and the 70s that are still in use that might be smaller, particularly in the more rural jurisdictions. that might
Mm.
not have any sprinkler protection at all, which is certainly a
Oh,
challenge
wow.
in today's environment. They're kind of, it's not that they shouldn't be sprinklered, it's that because of their age and lack of change in ownership and so forth, that those can exist out there.
Hmm, it's very interesting and obviously, concerning there a little bit for a facility that doesn't have that sprinkler protection. But I'm curious there on the in-rack sprinkler system, and I've seen some of those before. I've heard of some friends in the warehousing industry that have had to get them. But what is the determining factor that an in-rack sprinkler system needs to be installed or is required?
Well, I think one of the other misperceptions is that, if you have sprinklers, you're in good shape. And that just
Hmm.
isn't the case. It depends on what you're storing, how high you're storing, and what your water supply is. When it
Mm,
comes down to fire sprinkler design and fire protection in general, when it's a water based, a sprinkler based system, there's a lot of important factors. But the two probably most critical is what am I protecting, which gets
mm,
into not only I'll call it the widget, the commodity that the customer is either
right.
using or selling, but also the packaging, the arrangement, how we're storing it, the height we're storing that product, and then finally, from that perspective, probably the clearance from the top of the storage to the where the sprinklers are at the roof, and the sprinklers are located at the roof. And
Mm,
then for the in racks, the reason we go to in rack protection many times is either the water supply is not strong enough for the for just ceiling protection. And if you
mm,
think about it, with ceiling protection, that water has to get all the way down through that commodity, through the racking, through the
yeah.
structure, and get to the seat of the fire. Whereas if we put the sprinklers inside the racks, it's much easier for that water to get there faster and keep that fire smaller. There's
Mm,
clearly from a user operator standpoint with warehousing, there's some drawbacks to in-rack sprinklers. From a fire protection standpoint, they work very well, but from a user standpoint, there's concerns about them getting hit, uh, damaged, leaking, and so forth because of that damage, because of the forklifts or whatever the equipment is that is moving the product. And so we recognize that. So in many cases, traditionally, starting in probably in the 1980s and beyond, there was this
mm,
whole movement in the industry to try and keep sprinklers out of the racks as much as possible to make it easier for the users, the operators to operate the
yeah.
facilities. The challenge with that, obviously, is we go taller and we go with more hazardous products that are more susceptible to fire, that
Mm,
becomes more difficult to protect.
mm. Yeah, yeah, I think it's interesting, and that was kind of going to be my question there, and I think you answered it a little bit. But I mean, as we see, I think the evolution of the warehouse itself, the building structure itself. I mean, when we see new structures being built, I mean, we're going taller and taller. So I mean, are you seeing that pretty much at this point? Any type of new construction, if it is going to be racked, is pretty much going to be required or recommended to get that in rack sprinkler.
Again, it does depend on how tall that racking is. We still see,
Mm,
lower pile storage, cross dock and just
yeah.
above that, or manufacturing that might have a limited amount of raw or finished goods adjacent to their manufacturing facilities. But when we're talking true warehousing where automation might be involved, you're likely going to look at in-rack sprinklers being a requirement.
Mm,
Again, it's not 100%. We're certainly not anywhere near that yet. But as these buildings get taller and taller, where we're going instead of having what used to be when I got into the industry, a pretty common thing of, 20 feet of double row rack storage, two racks together with an aisle, we're now seeing those going to 40, 50, 60 feet, even beyond. And we've had this for many years, but structures that are actually attached to the racking, and the racking is actually supporting that structure. And so, with
mm,
those very tall buildings, anywhere from 40 to 80 feet in height with rack storage, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to have some amount of in rack sprinklers in those facilities.
mm. Yeah, interesting and good to know for sure. And I mean, I definitely see the both sides of it. Like you're saying, the challenge there for the operator. It is potential there that you could hit the sprinkler, right? I mean, that's what you're referring to, where you say, make it easier for the operator if you extend that pallet a little too far or something, and you bump into that. You got a little bit of a mess, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Definitely. So very interesting to kind of hear those different types of suppression systems and how that's kind of developed and in rack sprinkler systems as well. Now I'm curious from a compliance perspective, and there's I think the NFPA 13 is out there, which is kind of an overall industry regulation, if that's my understanding. But there's also then compliance within individual townships, cities, local ordinances, all these things. So how does a company, when they're looking at warehousing structures and going into a warehouse, I mean, how do they really ensure that they are in compliance with all the fire safety standards that are out there?
Well, it's critical to know your jurisdiction that you're going into or that
Hmm.
you're operating in and what their requirements are. If you're in the US, one of the in general, the most of the states adopt the International Building Code and fire codes of
Hmm.
some edition, some edition. It could be as recently as the 2021 edition, and as far back that I know of as I think the 2012 edition is the oldest that I know currently that's been is in use. Those reference the NFPA standards typically. Okay, so they will reference an edition of the NFPA standards. So it's really critical to know which edition of the building code and fire codes that are involved, and what editions that they are referencing. And if you're coming in with a newer facility, newer use type, or a newer system type in automation or some other factor, it's also critical that you understand how that jurisdiction, I'll call it, interprets or understands the building codes and the fire codes and the standards.
Mm.
Because even though these are fairly commonly used across the US and even internationally, the reality is each individual jurisdiction may have a different understanding or interpretation of how to apply the requirements. So, sitting down with them, having your fire protection professional sit down with them, walk through, making sure that that professional knows how you're going to use the building, what your facility use type and automation, if
Mm.
present, racking, other fixtures, palletized storage, and so forth. How that's going to be used so that they can come up with an appropriate plan to present to the jurisdiction. One of the things that's an opportunity, I would tell you from a code and standard standpoint, is again, which edition are we using? I don't know about you, but most of us like
Mm.
to have newer cell phones, right? Newer vehicles
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
last 2 to 5 years. But when a jurisdiction is using an older set of the codes that are referencing an older set of the standards, they're really looking and working off technology that is 10, 15 years old. Even the more recent ones, we know that as changes are occurring in the warehousing industry, we are not keeping up with that necessarily. And certainly the building codes that are adopted right now in the US are struggling with keeping up with that, whether it's the lithium battery issues, whether it's the
Mm.
automation issues, and so forth. When we talk about NFPA 13, it's been around since the 1890s. It's updated every 3 years. And I have, I sat on some of the NFPA technical committees, so I have a great affinity for NFPA and its process. But it can't keep up with the ever changing evolution that's going on in the industry. And so we
Mm.
tend to be a little bit behind times. There's also some other standards that can be applied. You can appeal to a jurisdiction and apply some insurance standards or some other international standards that are out there. Or more
Mm.
than likely, particularly on some of the more unique, is you might be even be going into conducting full scale fire testing and applying your what you find out of that, your findings out of that full scale testing to protect a facility. I'm not suggesting everyone needs to go out and do full scale testing, but I am suggesting that
Mm,
that is one of the options that's out there.
mm. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of things to consider there. And, I think it's important to know too, for maybe people that aren't familiar with the NFPA, like what does that stand for? What is that?
Sure. So NFPA is the National Fire Protection Association. Like I said, it's been around since the 1890s. It started out really as an insurance standard, right? When we first started protecting buildings with fire sprinkler systems, it was to protect the property, the business, right? It wasn't necessarily a life safety system. We were much more focused on how do we limit the damage and how
Mm,
to the building or the products, and how do we put that building that business back into service. Over the years, what we've recognized is there is an inherent life safety aspect to these sprinkler systems, and that helps us. But the driving force, probably through the 1970s, really was that property protection, either insurance driven, very limited building codes enforcement that was putting those
mm,
sprinkler systems into buildings. And so NFPA, like I said, is a nationally recognized standard. There's many standards that are within the family of NFPA, National Fire Protection Association. The one that we tend to think about the most from a sprinkler standpoint is NFPA 13, which is the design and installation standard. And
yeah.
every building code in the US does reference it in one way, shape, or form, one edition or another of that. And so that is how we design the systems and how we install the systems. If it's I'll call it a standard run of the mill system. So you think about a
Mm,
warehouse that's got single and double row racks, right? One rack, an
mm,
aisle, or two racks adjacent to each other in an aisle, or even multi row racks where you might have the flow through or the drive in type of racks. All that information on most of the commodities that we see out there is contained within an FPA 13. When you get into more unique challenges, more unique products, or handling of those commodity or racking systems, that's where we have to look a little bit outside and see
mm.
how we're going to protect those facilities.
Interesting, interesting. It's good to get that background too, and that understanding of the NFPA and NFPA 13 as well. And so you mentioned in there previously, and you mentioned that it's updated every 3 years, and you also mentioned a little bit about some of the automation that's coming into play and things of that nature. And I think when we look at automation and robotics, certainly I think the technology is advancing faster than every 3 years, right?
Yeah.
So when we look at that, we see these things developing, and I think some of the robotics automation you see is kind of it's the same as having a forklift almost in place within the operation. So it's not much of a change in the way the operation is taking place, but I think specifically when we look at something like an ASRS system, which is incredibly dense, I know there's some challenge there around fire suppression. There's been some questions raised, I think, in the industry too, of how do you make sure that those are fully I guess equipped to be able to handle those types of things. So talk to us a little bit about that, and how these kind of developments in technology maybe present challenges, or how are they being addressed from a fire safety perspective.
Well, one of the real challenges with these new automation systems, particularly the ASRS, is they're evolving so fast that even by the time you get the system built, the next one that you want to put in, or even in some cases, the one that you're working on and
Mm,
installing, there's already another innovation that the operators want to apply to that. And so keeping up from a code perspective is very challenging. One of the things that we do and that I'm involved in, but it is going on in the industry, is large scale testing of these systems. Because
mm,
if you think about it, there's been lots of testing for the last 50 or 60 years to develop NFPA 13 for that more traditional storage, but there hasn't been much in the way of the automated storage and retrieval systems, the ASRS systems, on how to protect them. And every
mm,
single one of them that we've tested And over the last, well, even last year, I think we did 18 weeks of large scale testing in the labs. So a year before was 20 weeks. We've already got 12 weeks of testing this year. Uh, but every single one of those, there is something unique and changing. We've tested the same system in some cases two or three times because maybe they've widened out the bays, maybe they've
mm,
narrowed the distance between from tier to tier, from tote to tote, or whatever it might be. Because you're right, there's ones that are relatively simple that are basically robots that are lifts,
mm,
and there's other ones that are going in and picking multiple totes, in a very narrow or compact area, either horizontal shuttle, or mini load, those types of things that are out there, top loading and so forth. And each one of them have unique challenges. Some of those challenges include, they're much more densely packed. So
mm,
how do we get the sprinklers to operate? How do we get the water to the fire? Um, Other ones is even if we can control the fire from the outside or from the ceiling or whatever it might be, because you can't put in-rack sprinklers in them. There's just no physical
yeah.
space to do that. They're so dense that how do I get to once I control that fire, how does the firefighters get in and put that fire out?
Mm,
Most people, I guess I probably should have mentioned that too. Most people think that sprinklers put fires out, but they really don't. In
mm,
most cases, they either control the fire so the firefighters can show up and extinguish them, or they might even suppress the fire, meaning greatly reduce the size, but
mm,
not completely extinguish. You don't design to extinguish. Sometimes you get lucky, and the fires are extinguished, but that's not a normal process. And
mm,
so really I think going forward, what we're going to see, what we are seeing, what we have been seeing for probably the last 10 years, and will continue to see for some time, is this focus on testing, because that way we know we've got the proper protection. If you go by the prescriptive, meaning NFPA 13, or even some of the other
mm,
insurance standards, the cost to protect the facilities can be significantly more than they traditionally have. Literally miles on miles of pipe in the building, in the racks, and you might not be getting all of the protection that you think you should be. It's
mm,
amazing that if you just change a few parameters, maybe some clearance height distance between tiers, maybe the type of sprinkler that you're using, how that impacts the protection and the ability to suppress or control that fire.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot there, and certainly a challenge, like you said. I mean, I've seen some ASRS systems that are very big, and I can imagine if there's a fire in the middle of one of them. I mean, it would be very difficult to get to. So I'm curious from those solution providers' sides, like the ones who are developing these systems. Obviously you said there's some large scale testing going on to make sure that how do these things perform or operate, or what happens when there is a fire within them. But I've heard that the theory is that like basically when the tote gets full of water, like it'll just overflow and it'll make its way to the bottom. And I have seen some where totes have holes in them as well, which allows the water to get further through. But I mean, are you seeing that the solution providers are trying to design and take into account this fire safety potential issue? I mean, how do you think that's kind of going about? Are they cooperative in that way?
They are. Many of them are. Certainly, there's early adopters and late adopters that you have in every situation, but most of the ones that we've come across so far, most of our clients and the ones that we're working with with other providers, we what we find is that they are early, pushing early adoption of their own technology, and so
Mm,
they need to make sure that what they're providing can provide the level of protection that is appropriate so that they can stay in compliance, and keep their customers satisfied to come back. One of the challenges early on with somebody who was either new to the industry or or just hasn't had the experience in in some of the jurisdictions in the U.S., what they find is they come in and they assume that they can install their systems without
mm,
really recognizing that the impact to the fire protection. Once they're educated on that a little bit, and they will get that generally through some interaction with jurisdictions or some of the other fire protection professionals, they recognize that there is concern here, and how are they going to address. And some of them, actually, a few of
mm.
them that we've worked with, actually look at it as an advantage for their business, that they've got proven solutions that they can implement. There is that portion of it as well to consider.
Hmm, interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's good to hear they're taking that into consideration because I mean, I think it's very important, right? I mean, if you have, I can only imagine, getting a fire in one of those or something, and it becomes a bigger issue than it would maybe in a traditional racking system where it's more openness and things like that. So, I mean, it's very interesting to dive in this topic. I think there's a lot of different facets to it and different things to think about overall. And sometimes I think things too that maybe we don't think about because a fire hasn't happened, right? But it's something that needs to be thought about in case that ever does happen, right? So as we look at that and kind of maybe as we close up the conversation here, maybe you could give us some kind of insight from the warehouse perspective. Like, what is something that you see as maybe most commonly overlooked from a fire safety perspective, and what would you advise someone to like definitely check on or prepare for, that you see as kind of just a common thing that comes up?
I think a common thing that comes up is the change in the facilities and the commodities, right? If I've been
Mm,
operating a facility for 5, 10, 40 years, right?
yeah.
And now I want to bring in this automation, or my product mix is going to change. I mean, it tends to be a little nibble at a time, right? If you think about, I think about my career and also my life. I think about the things we were going to the store and buying in the 1970s with my parents.
Mm,
Quite a bit different, the products and their materials, than what I go in today
yeah.
and purchase, right? And so that addition of more plastics and more flammable liquids and aerosols and all those commodities become a much more challenging fire. And so you have sprinkler protection. You may have had it for the life of the building, and you may have been in that building for a long time. But I think taking a look at what changes have occurred and having a professional take a look at that and make sure that you are protected, because these fires do occur. We don't hear about
Right.
them a lot, but I can think of one that happened last year that took, a building to the ground. Over 1 million
Mm,
square feet. You can think about,
wow.
and that is not an uncommon occurrence. I mean, it is not a normal occurrence, but you see those. I think last year we saw three fairly large buildings that went to the ground,
Mm,
or had very significant damage, and and that has an interruption to the community, right?
yeah.
And with loss of business, it has an interruption to that business for its business interruption. Distribution centers are typically supplying multiple facilities, and so having that review. I would also mention that when we didn't talk about NFPA 25, it is one of the documents that we commonly look at from an inspection, testing, and maintenance of these systems. Maintenance is incredibly important. If you
Mm,
look at a sprinkler system that has failed to provide that protection, about 60 to 70% of the time is because the system wasn't maintained properly. A lot of it has to do with the water supply. And there are
mm,
requirements in NFPA 25 that are not part of your annual inspection that you may be having, but it is to review on a regular basis when you have these major changes, or at least every 5 years, to have a separate professional come in and take a look at the facility and make sure that you're protecting it properly. So I think it's understanding what's changing. I think the other thing that you might look at as a common occurrence is water supply. We tend to think our water supplies are stable, and they generally are in the U.S., But as
Yeah.
more buildings get built around us, as that infrastructure ages, that can change our water supply and therefore its capability to provide the protection that we've been expecting.
Interesting, interesting. And when you refer to the water supply, I mean, are you referring to the amount of water that's readily accessible for that sprinkler to use, or like the pressure of the water? What are you referring to there?
It's generally the pressure. Most
Got it.
systems in the U.S. are supplied by the public system, public water
Yeah.
supply, and that water supply tends to be relatively stable from a volume standpoint. But what does tend to change is pressure.
Mm,
Warehousing
interesting.
sometimes will have many times will have fire pumps as well, but if they aren't getting as much pressure on the incoming side of that fire pump, then they won't have as much pressure on the outgoing side of that fire pump.
Mm, very interesting. Interesting. Very interesting stuff with you here, Ralph, and certainly very important topic as well. And I think that kind of last tip there around the maintenance of the systems as well is incredibly important too. I mean, it's one thing to put them in place. But it's one thing to make sure that they're still working the way they're supposed to work 5 years later, right, or 10 years later, however long. So, very important there, and great information that you've shared with us today, and certainly an interesting topic and very relevant and important to the safety within our warehouses that are out there. So, I appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us about this. If people are interested in learning more about Telgian and maybe getting in touch about their fire safety systems and practices that are in place, what's the best way to do that?
Probably reaching out through our website. There's a Telgian.com is out there, and of course you can also Google my name, and that'll lead you to the Telgian website.
All right, Google him, Ralph Bless. You got it. All right, we'll definitely put all that information at the newwarehouse.com as well so people can easily find it. So, Ralph, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.